what do you attribute to not just the strikes going on, which we'll talk about, but all of these workers quitting, or a ton of workers just not going back to these jobs that are technically open, but are still paying non-living wage jobs? Is it because they have a little bit more savings now from COVID relief, or are there other factors going on?
Now, there's not much indication that they accumulated much more savings. I think what you're seeing is what I tried to refer to before. Let's look at it this way. You have an economic system, capitalism, here in the United States. And then we have this pandemic. We have a virus. The human race has lived with viruses for thousands of years. We know all about it. We had one 100 years ago called the Spanish flu, which killed almost as many people as COVID has now killed here in the United States and globally as well. So there's no excuse for being unprepared because you know all about this. So what we should have had, of course, had we been a rational economic system, is we would have had located in warehouses around the country an adequate number of tests and masks and ventilators and all the rest of what you need to deal with the pandemic of a virus. And remember, in the recent years, we also had SARS and we had MERS and we had Ebola. We've got lots of reminders that we need to be prepared. These reminders in a capitalist system went nowhere because the profit motive led all kinds of businesses not to stockpile what you need to produce that. It led the politicians they put into office to think it was terribly efficient not to make sure there were adequate hospitals and ICU units and all the rest. Okay, so we have a system that didn't prepare, and that therefore it was a system that didn't cope real well. And when everything had to close down because we were dying at record numbers, what did we realize in our little capitalist brains? If we're going to lay off half of the labor force, and that's the percentage of people who were unemployed for some period of time in the first year, between March of 2020 and March of 2021. Half of our labor force, 60 million people. Okay, wow. You know what you had to do? You had to do something for them. Because in a capitalist system, if you just say to them, don't come to work, you're done, you're going to have a revolution right now. Capitalism be over. Nobody would tolerate it. So what you had to do is to compensate for the failure of capitalism to prepare for a pandemic by giving people money. You gave them their unemployment, and since that's not enough to survive, especially if you've got extra expenses like dealing with your children who aren't going to school and all the rest of it, you gave them an extra $300 a week. Hardly millionaire fare, but enough to get them through without a revolution. And now you're discovering that the people who got that extra are now asking a question. Let's see, this system was able to give me X $100 a week to get through a failure of the system. Why am I going back to a job that treats me badly, pays me poorly, and I work real hard, and I don't come home with much more than what I got when I was doing nothing because the system couldn't find a place for me? Yeah, those people are pulling back. Calling them lazy, that's Republican junk. That's the way you've always justified the difference between you who have a job and the person who doesn't. No empathy, no compassion, no willingness. You're so frightened about what it might mean that there are millions of people that you take care of yourself, number one, by pissing on them, if you pardon my Spanish, when they're down, when they don't have a job like you. Woe is it to you when your time for unemployment comes if people treat you that way. No, I don't think laziness has got anything to do with it. Laziness is in the eye of the beholder. It's sort of like beauty. The people who you call lazy, if you spend 5 minutes with them, you'll understand the difficulties, the pain, the problems. Sure, some people keep working when their arm is broken. Other people go and say, my arm hurts, and they get a doctor to look at them. You're going to call one of them lazy? Stop it. It's
Right.
childish, it's vicious, and all it does is drive further wedges in the society. And guess what? It'll be those same Republicans who scratch their heads wondering why the society is falling apart when they're doing their part at the bar with that kind of talk, making it fall apart.
And laziness, by the way, is also from the mouth of the
Yes,
propagandists at
yes,
Fox News,
absolutely.
Rush Limbaugh, and all of this,
We
lift
used
all boats nonsense for the
it's
last
the
30
same
years.
mentality. It's called blaming the victim. It's the
Yes.
same mentality that says the woman who got raped had a blouse that was too tight. It forgets what the difference is between those who do something active and dangerous versus those who suffer. I mean, it is the sad legacy of a society that begins as ours does by the total slaughter of the population it finds in this country. We ought to examine our own history and wonder why we do this. In Europe, for example, the whole pandemic, which was horrible there, and they have their problems, but they made a decision in most of the European countries. Nobody loses their job. Nothing like what the United States did. You didn't have millions of people saying, oh my God, I lost my job. I don't know if my job will be there when I get back. I don't know under what conditions it'll be there. Because they took care of their people by saying, not only will the government help you through this bad time, but your job is untouchable. You keep your job, your seniority, your particular place in the workforce. None of that is going to be wrecked on top of your fear about COVID. I mean, what kind of a society does that to itself? We ought to wonder about it before we stifle all the questions we ought to have by celebrating one more time that we're the greatest country in the world. I mean, this is painful to watch because it's the behavior of people that are in a very sad situation.
And I'd like to ask, in 2019, I went to Detroit. The media didn't cover it or barely covered it, but General Motors laid off 15,000 workers after they got a $51 billion bailout, mind you. So I was on the ground there. And this 2019, I mean, we're only talking 2 years ago, but it might as well have been 2 decades ago, because when I was on the ground there, it was really just kind of this isolated strike. Obviously, GM, huge company, multinational company, but international company. But you didn't really have like the mutual aid organizing that's going on now. You didn't really have all these other companies donating to striking workers. Some, but not the really increasing organized network now of mutual aid. I spoke with UAW workers that are striking now for John Deere, telling me about all these companies that are contributing donations, just the community, the outpouring of community support. Now, do you attribute this kind of change exclusively to the pandemic and people just finally waking up? Because I kind of look at it, I mean, you have a 40-year controlled demolition of what was the middle class. So I feel like that and the whole, like, we're not going to take it anymore mentality mixed with COVID is why you're seeing this spread. But I wanted to see what you thought.
Yeah, no, I think you're seeing that. I think you're getting, it's very predictable. We are a country that leans to the right. It's a legacy of our history. It's not good or bad. It is the way it is. And I think we have to face it. And what it means to lean to the right is that when shocks hit the system, whether they come from inside or outside, doesn't matter. The first instinct is to go to the right because that's your culture. So if you have the World Trade Center gets bombed or attacked, when we go and attack Afghanistan and we go and we invade Iraq, and we're going to do what? Think through what this problem is? No. We're going to go and do something right wing. And after a while, when it turns out that this isn't smart, this isn't solving the problem, then you begin to create the question, the open question that allows the left tendencies, which are very strong in America too, to begin to emerge. So yeah, you got the right-wing solution, but then 20 years later, we withdraw from Afghanistan, and the people who were weak when we started, the Taliban, are now the people in charge. And maybe some lesson is coming through there. Maybe people are realizing that when you're upset about the status quo, you don't have to go to the right with Trump. You can go to the left with Bernie Sanders. There's reasons for all of this. And I think that's happening in terms of what you see in Detroit. And the pandemic was that. It was a sense for a while, wow, we are all being assaulted by a terrible fear and a terrible risk, and for some of us, a terrible disease. And maybe, the right wing wants us to blame the Chinese, which has exactly as much sense as invading Iraq and Afghanistan, as if they're going to solve any of our problems, which it didn't, and it couldn't. And people are beginning to recognize, gee, we weren't prepared for that pandemic. We didn't have the wherewithal to cope with it very well. The United States does have 4% of the world's population and 16% of the world's dead from COVID. And for a rich country, that should be an alarming statistic.